Essentially, just memories flowing from afar like a planetary charge raining down from the stars. It's a simple life on Mars with a lot of time to hesitate. It's easier to meditate outside of this conglomerate. Found a letter in a monolith for a paleontologist and suddenly was standing in a rather strange aquarium and wondering just where we'd been before we were American and whispered in the air within, "We'll be right back there again. We'll be right back there again. We'll be right back there again."
Curtailed because of a revulsion felt by the people in the aggressor nations. The old appeals to racial, sexual, and religious chauvinism and to rabid nationalist fervor are beginning not to work. A new consciousness is developing which sees the earth as a single organism and recognizes that an organism at war with itself is doomed. We are one planet.
But I'm always struck by the dissonance between the technical illegibility and the mythical legibility of these systems. And in particular, it is the most mythed and storied up area I have ever seen or covered. I mean, we have however many decades of sci-fi. We have Ultron and HAL and Skynet and The Matrix and Asimov's laws of robotics. And then going backwards, we have fantasy and summoning. And then people talk about the golems and the Sorcerer's Apprentice. And I've recommended it before, but Megan O'Gieblin's great book, God, Human, Animal, Machine, right, is sort of all about a lot of the Christian mythology operating in a sub-rosa way here. Singularity is a very mythic concept, right? Very similar, very eschatological to things you'll see in raptures and so on. And there's this way in which we don't understand these systems that well, and then we perhaps understand them all too well. I mean, you could argue we're getting trapped in stories that maybe it doesn't net out that way at all. Maybe this stuff tops out at a fairly low level, right? It's a pretty good chatbot, and we're not able to get to these super intelligences, and we've led ourselves astray with however many years of imagining what we could create. But it's something I've appreciated about your work because I notice it just traveling through this world, how mythed up it is, how much people are operating with stories running in the back of their minds, both consciously and unconsciously. And those stories are creating a lot of interpretive framework because they're standing in for things we actually don't yet know how to interpret.
Yeah, or might not be able to. There's always a place where we're dealing with these changing human models and cognitions. And now we know that, like, as the technologies, not just in AI, but technologies get more and more powerful, we were like, what? How do we wrap our heads around this? Well, we got all this science fiction lying around. That makes sense. So there is this problem about self-fulfilling prophecies, about getting caught by narratives that then shape your view so much that you're not able to see other developments. So we absolutely have to be aware of these things. And a lot of my work has been, again, a kind of like a two-step process where on the one hand, I'm even more open for the mythological potentials, the speculative possibilities, the wild dreamings than your standard sort of culture critic. And at the same time, it's like, yes, and we must deconstruct and see what that story is kind of telling us because we are in a place of kind of self-fulfilling prophecies.
Well, and that's particularly true for this technology. I largely agree with people who say that no technology is truly neutral. But compared to a semiconductor or a bandsaw, AI trained on human language, where all these myths and all these stories are in the training set. So when we ask it to basically act like an AI, what it understands, again, these verbs are tricky here, but what it is able to reflect back at us because of the way it is pattern matched across our language is the stories we have written about how AIs interact and act in relationship to human beings. There is this funny sense, particularly with large language models, where the more we have story told about them, the more they are trained on the stories, the more we have created a thing that is our own imagining of the thing that we have created. It's why I've always had a slightly different take on the Kevin Roose, Bing Sydney conversation that went very viral at the New York Times. I mean, that was very clearly to me that whatever was powering Microsoft chatbot, it had read enough, it had been trained on enough data about rogue AI slipping the reins, that it knew how to answer that question that he was beginning to get at, to provoke it towards. And that's, again, just very weird.
Absolutely. No, that's a wonderful example. I mean, one of the things that my work is motivated by is that there's better or worse myths that you can bring to trying to understand things that have some kind of mythological dimension. And in this case, I would say that the AI it doesn't have agency in the way that we keep assuming that it does, so that when people try to find its real motivation, it's such an easy model to get into. And like you say, it's just simulating a character that is responding to what it perceives as your question. So what do you have then is this immense series of simulations of characters based on stories. It's a Proteus. It's not an evil genius. That's what it's doing, is that it's responding and reflecting and circulating. And indeed, one of I think the greatest things about the technology from a humanist point of view is that it forces us to think about all this stuff really seriously, really strongly. Like, what does it mean to have our concepts about reality fed back to us in this way? How do we trust stories? Are we made of stories? You know, all of these kinds of chin-stroking questions become a lot more pertinent right now.
I guess one part of it I'd want to open up a little bit. And you can tell me if this is what you're saying in a way, or it's actually a totally different point. But as I think of one of the central, in the way California, in the way Silicon Valley thinks about technology, as being about whether or not we create technology and then it is ours to control, or we create technology and then it acts back upon us. I mean, you can say, look, it's just trained on our language. And so it is under our control, it's simply just parroting us back at us. But the idea that that will stop there, right? The idea that is somehow a way of putting it in a box and then you can be like, okay, it's safely in the box. That's a pretty profound mistake. Twitter changes people, Facebook changes people, the internet changes people. I mean, I've become a big Marshall McLuhanite in my middle age. And this idea that these mediums and technologies always change the people using them, in some cases do so more so than anybody realizes, is, I always feel, the single biggest missed understanding among technologists who you'd think would know better.
Yeah, I'm surprised at that as well. I mean, I was a Marshall McLuhanite from the get-go, and always very interested in precisely the ways that there were unexpected affordances to media technologies, new technologies that shifted not just what we did or how we even imagine culture, but who we are, how our brains are constructed, how our senses of the world are constructed, and to have respect for the unknown outcome. And that's something that's always sort of terrified me about contemporary technological development, is the lack, whether you want to think about it as hubris or a certain narrow-minded belief that we can control the meanings and effects of these technologies, and the willingness to just throw really powerful things just into society in general, just treat the whole thing as a petri dish, as a competitive petri dish too. And in some ways, it's just inherent in the way in which we ended up expressing capitalism in terms of how the competition operates. But it has often surprised me how technologists themselves don't necessarily acknowledge it. The people that I've always known were always most interested in that. Like, they had that kind of McLuhan-esque view, which in a way is kind of an animist view. It's like there's something in the object that has it's got its own story to tell. It's going to make a move, and we're in a relationship. There's an interactive relationship with these things that have effects that we cannot predict, and we have to work it out over time and work it out in a way together. But there's so little time for the degree of transformations that we're making with these new technologies that it almost seems like the blinkered view that we can control something as powerful as the large language models released into society at large. It's like one of those delusions that people have that enable them to continue to function in their job properly. But it's very hard for me to appreciate that.
So to be McLuhanized for a minute, to take his famous saying, the medium is message. If the medium is a message, if the medium encodes certain ways of being and thinking that change the people who use it, what do you think the message of the AI chatbot medium is? Which is worth noting is a medium being built on top of a technology. Chatbotting is just one of many, many applications. And the fact that that's one taking off is going to also shape the technology differently than it might otherwise shape. But yeah, what's the message of the medium?
Wow, that is an extraordinary question. I must admit, I'm spinning a bit here because there's so much going on.
Let me try one on you, which is that something that I think is very present in the way people are thinking about AI is the idea that the output is what matters, and that the sort of work of knowledge, of creation, is this kind of, you run a search on the information in your head, and then you, or maybe now to make your life easier and quicker, the AI spits out the output, right? It kind of condenses it down and more or less predicts what you need. And there's much more, I think, if you pay attention to yourself as a human being, mystery in that process. So one thing I am skeptical of is that AI is actually going to make people better at as much as they think it will. For instance, the work of writing, and Ted Chiang, the sci-fi writer, has made this point, the work of writing a bad first draft is not just a waste of time on your way to a good fourth draft. It is often an intellectual space in which you realize you shouldn't be writing that draft at all, in which you realize actually you should be doing a totally different piece, in which you realize something that you had never thought of and that isn't within the training set for that draft is actually relevant here. And it's that kind of mysterious, intuitive sense that leads to the creation of great work, also often just decent work. The number of times that I've been driving around in the car and come up with the column idea that turns out to be exactly what I needed, but very different than what I had when I got in the car is many. And that idea that we can just outsource that, I think it's a way of thinking of ourselves as computers, as opposed to the more slightly mysterious creatures we are. But by applying that analogy then onto the computer and kind of suggesting that people are going to be so much better off if they have the AI write their draft for them, I mean, that to me is a way we could then change in that direction. If people actually begin doing that and stop doing that work themselves, some things will be gained. It will be quicker to summarize a bunch of data into an output, but it's also making yourself more like an AI and less like a human being.
Yeah, it's remarkable the way in which there's an invitation to let go of a certain space of the unknown, the mysterious, the novel, the unpredictable in our own minds. And perhaps one scenario is that it becomes clear that these things are insufficient. And so we become even more aware and we honor that aspect of ourselves even more. But there's also the possibility that it wasn't necessary all along. And it is easy to imagine a situation where we become used to offloading more and more and more decisions, and thereby accepting that we too are predictable machines. So I think maybe part of that message has to do with prediction and pattern, and what is in us that is not predictable, that is not pattern. And then can we isolate that? Can we put our finger on it? But isn't that very putting the finger on it part of the loop? Where do we put it? And where do we use that as a way of saying enough? Or like, no, I'm not going to do this. No, I'm not going to turn. Even now, I'm very aware of when, what is it? Like 80% of things people watch on Netflix are based on the recommendation engines. Like, oh, that's a lot, I grew up, my whole world was like cultural recommendations, opinions, how people constituted themselves through their taste, through turning people on, all these forms of sociality. Like this whole world is already kind of passing as we just feed ourselves and we give up that kind of human negotiation of decision, of taste, of options. So we can already see that happening. And my hope is that it just makes it more obvious, let's say in things like writing or poetry, where we have a revenge of the humanities, in the sense that those things that humanities are pointing to, that's precisely what eludes the repetition, at least hopefully.